Hello and welcome to today's video blog post on the concept of outbound REST in ServiceNow Express. We're going to see how using business rules to kick off outbound REST calls in Express allows us to easily integrate with other Express instances, including ourselves, meaning we can use it as a mechanism for auto-creating any records in the system based off that business rule call. We'll also see how easy it is to formulate those REST endpoints and to point them at any system third party you may have that accepts a REST endpoint. And we'll see how it comes into play with defining these, setting up the rules, some best practices, and the data found therein. So as we begin, we're going to take a look first of all at what is required when we define our REST calls. So in a REST call, first of all, it's going to be kicked off from a business rule. Before we go to those rules though, let's take a look at the pure messages. So at a high level, each endpoint will have its own REST message record. So I'm going to be running through a few examples of updating a record in another external application, in this case a Fuji instance. I'm going to be talking about sending a call right back into that same instance for internal workflow or any other use case like that. And let's talk about how that data is defined. So let's take the case of an external instance that we're trying to connect to. So first of all, the first thing you're going to define is the endpoint of where that REST service is expecting. Now, every call, generally get, post, put, delete, is going to have a maybe more specific endpoint. For our example, a call made for put requires the sysid. So you'll notice here in the put call, it's actually an endpoint that has /$ bracket, sysid bracket. And we'll get to why we do that in a second. Simply here at this REST message though, we pick our authentication if any is required, and you'll put in that username and password in that basic auth profile. For the HTTP request, you could put any custom headers that may be sent, such as content type, application/JSON, or accept application JSON. But you could define those on the individual calls as well. Let's take a look in this example at our put and post items. So here in post, what we're simply doing is we're hitting that endpoint and we're providing the headers for accept application JSON, content type application JSON, and the important part is our payload. We're sending the following content in this outbound REST post. And what you'll notice is my classic key value pair, short description, but now my value is $ bracket, short underscore desk, and bracket. Now the name in here doesn't really matter, this is just the variable name, but this syntax of $ left curly brace, the verbiage and right curly brace, that's what's going to allow us to dynamically create these what we call variable substitutions. So the variable substitutions, after you type in that content like that and you press auto-generate variables, the system will actually create for you those variables. So short description, and this linked sysid, and I'll get to why I passed this specific parameter in a second. So when you're trying to understand how to figure out what that content is going to look like, what headers should be involved, what that endpoint is, when it's a ServiceNow to ServiceNow integration, I highly encourage the REST API Explorer. This is a simple way to get all that data. Let's say we're trying to duplicate a record created in this instance in an external instance. So I'm just going to say create a record, in our case post. We're going to say to the incident table, and we're going to want to pass, let's say, a short description. So I'm going to add a field, short description, and then that's going to be, again, $, curly brace, short desk, whatever I want to make it, and curly brace. Maybe I want to add another field, and we're going to say, okay, this other field is going to be, a linked sysid, because maybe when we're doing a creation post, we want to also tell that other instance what our sysid is, so that when that other instance makes an update, we can actually do a put past that sysID and dynamically keep the record synced between two instances. So from here, you just copy paste this body, and that goes directly into that payload body that we saw of the REST message. When you're wondering about headers, just look in any of these programming examples. I could see, okay, I've got two headers here, accept application JSON, content type, application JSON. So another easy way to immediately understand those key value pairs, you just copy paste them over. And keep in mind it's dynamic based off the selections and the items that you apply in here. The final simple one is, of course, this URL. If you add in URL parameters, you'll need to dynamically append those. But basically, this is the URL that's the endpoint that you post into that REST message. So let's go back to our example and talk about, with that in mind, what we saw in terms of the data we put in. So clicking in, the endpoint comes from the simple endpoint. If it's a third-party app, it'll have its own documentation for what its endpoint will be. If it's an Express instance, use the API Explorer. Basic authentication, just a simple ServiceNow account, username, password, or for your third-party app, username, password. Here, we mentioned so far the post, but let's talk about that update concept of a put. Keep in mind, in my post, I passed this value for linked sysID. And this is an important one. Let me switch over to that other instance that I'm going to be integrating with. And you'll see here into these records, what I'm going to do as part of this integration is when I create a record in instance 1, not only am I going to send a REST post call to create an instance 2, but I've made this string field here for linked sysID, which I'll be populating with the sysID. The reason we do that is now when I make an update to the record on this instance, I want to send it back to my original instance, and the only way to do that is using a put and dynamically passing that sysID value. So when I head back over, I'll understand that, okay, that's why I passed my sysID, and we'll look into the business rule of how that is in a second. So for my put call here, we can easily understand that now my endpoint, I actually appended this /$ bracket sysID and curly brace, And that's because that's the syntax from our API Explorer that we use for an update or a put. And the content I'm going to send in for that update is simply going to be, again, an updated short description. But it really could be every field if you wanted to. Send it over, update it over. So these REST messages are the pure messages of the endpoints you're hitting and what body content are you sending. The actual mechanisms that we'll be triggering and sending these is going to be business rules. So let's look at two examples right now. One of them is going to be a REST post. The other is going to be a REST update. So here we are going to be in a business rule just like any other business rule. And I'm going to run on incident when I insert a record. What I'm going to want to say is also a filter condition perhaps, saying the created by user or whoever opened it is not that API user that I'm using. And this is because you don't want to infinite loop yourself. So always exclude whatever that basic authentication account is you're using, exclude it as a created by. So I always advise, create a new account called like REST account, give it the admin credential, and use that in terms of the basic auth. That way, you can easily filter out that REST credential user. And for non-reference fields, it's probably the sysID it's expected. The next thing that you're going to simply need to do is over here, beyond actions, we have web services. So this is where I pick what the web service endpoint is going to be. So in my case, let me say my external ServiceNow instance. I'd like to do a post. So it's using that post method. And then those variables, those curly brace name, $, curly brace name, and curly brace, all those variables I can now dynamically populate. So short description, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stick in my short description. SysID I'll stick in same as sysid. And we could do 2 if we wanted to for a static value, but usually you'll be doing something dynamic like this with the same as. So let's take a look at this in action. I'm going to head over and I'm going to create a new incident. I'm going to create new. This is going to be our REST post test to other instance. And I'm going to go ahead and submit. And what we'll be able to see is as I open up my other instance, we're going to see that record coming over. REST post test to other instance immediately synced due to that outbound business rule with that post call. The other thing you'll see is the sysid is linked perfectly. It's now available here in my linked sysid, which is why if I now did an update business rule to send content from this back over to the other instance, I'll basically dynamically populate sysid with this linked sysid field. Let's take a look at the other example, however, of, maybe we want to do that update of an external record. So I'm going to right click here and I'm just going to copy this sysid for our example. And I'm going to come back into this instance. And let's look at that business rule that we had in place for when an update occurs. So I'm going to come in once more, configure, go into my business rules, and look at my REST update test. We're basically saying we want to run when, again, the update is not done by that API REST user, because if it is, we don't want to infinite loop ourselves, continuously add a comment in system B, back to A, back to B, back to A. So we say it's not that API user. Then we're going to say the linked sysid is not empty, because if it's not integrated to another record, we don't need to worry about an external update. So if it is though, and this could be maybe an ID, a unique identifier for a third-party app, doesn't have to be ServiceNow. We're basically going into our web services here, and we're populating sysid same as this linked sysid, and let's populate the short description same as, let's just do a 2, for example, and say updated via REST put. I'll go ahead and I'll update this call here. So now I'm going to come back to a record here. Let's just open, this same incident. I'll post in that link ID, which would have been auto-populated through that create. Again, this is just a demo example. And when I go to save, when we head back to the other instance here, and I go and I reload this record, what we'll be able to see is that it's going to override that existing short description right there with the updated via REST put. So the final example that we're going to be walking through is just instance to instance for a concept of basic, one to another A to B record creation. And this could be expanded to a very broad workflow, because keep in mind, record A makes B, maybe you want to have B make C, etc., etc. So a great way to expand the auto creation of records. So let's see it in action. What I'm going to come over here is I'm going to open up my REST messages. We're going to see my self instance. This is one I did that just points to the same instance I'm in basically for this example. So let's head over back to our business rules, and I'm going to open up that REST post one, and I'm just going to make sure that the instance that I'm pointing to is not that third-party app, in my example, the Fuji instance, but it's my self instance. So I'm just going to switch that reference so the endpoint is proper. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to go and I'm going to create that record. So to do it, it's now live. I could actually go in and test it. So to make sure we don't loop, just as a quick example, another thing to keep in mind with these REST messages is we have test functionality, which is great. Before committing to this business rule, I clicked in back to my HTTP, my post call, and let's make sure this is the post for my same instance endpoint. So I'm just going to go into my REST messages, go into my self instance, go into my post, and what I want to show is here, down at the bottom, you'll notice there's this test section. And here, for every variable substitution, basically it means any variable declared with the syntax up here, we can supply a test value. So here's going to be my REST test for self-instance workflow integration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and simply press test. And it's actually going to run this specific REST command, populating the content with this item here. So when I press test, I'm going to see, looks like it was a success at 201 response. And when I go back to my open instance, I understand my self-instance test for integration is indeed working. So one thing to be wary of, again, as I've warned, is that infinite looping. Don't send a call to yourself without those proper checks. So as you'll see here, you're going to have it continuously creating those records. So to adequately do that, make sure in your business rules, you're constantly checking that you aren't looping by filtering out, for example, this creation here. I want to filter out the created by isn't that specific user. Or in our case, let's just make sure that the short description also doesn't contain our API, test that we've been doing. So however you want to set it, up to you, but just make sure you don't get caught in those loops, and you'll have a successful time integrating with third-party applications or with other ServiceNow instances, including your own.